Sometimes, the heroes we overlook are sitting right beside us. In a world where age and appearance often determine respect, one bus driver learned that assumptions about worthiness can shatter in an instant. This is the story of a man who carried himself with quiet dignity while hiding a legacy that had shaped the very freedom others took for granted. What happened when his true identity was revealed would remind everyone on that bus that honor doesn't announce itself. It simply exists, waiting patiently to be recognized. If stories like this restore your faith in the heroes who walk among us unnoticed, please consider subscribing and hitting that like button. The bus driver told the veteran, "Move, that seat isn't yours." The old man quietly stood up and started walking toward the back. But when the driver noticed the small patch insignia on the man's jacket, he froze and shouted, "Sir, from which city in the world are you watching this video today?" If this story resonates with you, please subscribe for more moments where quiet dignity meets unexpected recognition and where true honor reveals itself in the most ordinary places. The number 47 Metro bus rumbled through downtown Seattle on a gray Tuesday morning, its diesel engine struggling against the steep hills that define the city's landscape. Rain pelted the windows in a steady rhythm that had become the soundtrack of Pacific Northwest life, while inside, the usual collection of early commuters settled into their routines. Office workers clutching coffee cups, students with oversized backpacks, and service employees heading to shifts that kept the city running. Behind the wheel sat Marcus Thompson, a 38-year-old driver who had been working this route for 12 years. Marcus took pride in maintaining order on his bus, though his definition of order had gradually shifted from ensuring passenger safety to enforcing his personal views about who deserved what level of service. He had developed strong opinions about the homeless population, elderly passengers who moved too slowly, and anyone who didn't fit his narrow definition of a productive citizen. Marcus had grown up in South Seattle, where his single mother had worked 2 jobs to keep their family afloat. He had watched her struggle with people who, in his view, took advantage of the system without contributing their fair share. This experience had shaped his worldview into a rigid hierarchy where respect was earned through visible productivity and social conformity. At the 3rd Avenue stop, several passengers climbed aboard, including an elderly man who moved with deliberate care up the bus steps. The man appeared to be in his late 70s, with silver hair that suggested he had once maintained military standards, but now showed the casual styling of retirement. He wore a worn leather jacket that had seen better days, dark slacks that were clean but clearly old, and walking shoes that prioritized comfort over appearance. What Marcus saw was another elderly passenger who would probably move slowly, potentially hold up the route, and likely complain about something during the journey. He didn't notice the way the man carried himself with unconscious military bearing, the careful way he scanned the bus interior upon entering, or the small details that might have suggested a background worth respecting. The old man paid his fare with exact change, counting out coins with slightly arthritic fingers that still moved with precision. He nodded politely to Marcus and began walking toward the front section of the bus, where several seats designated for elderly and disabled passengers offered easier access and better visibility of stops. "Hold on there, old-timer," Marcus called out before the man could sit down. "Those front seats are for people who actually need them. You look like you can make it to the back just fine." The elderly man paused, looking at Marcus with patient eyes that had seen far more than the bus driver could imagine. "I am 78 years old," he said quietly, his voice carrying the controlled tone of someone accustomed to dealing with difficult situations. "I believe I qualify for priority seating." Marcus felt a flash of irritation at being questioned, even politely. In his mind, too many people used age as an excuse for special treatment they hadn't earned. "Age is just a number, buddy," I see plenty of old folks who are sprier than people half their age. Move to the back, so these seats stay open for people who really need them. Other passengers began to notice the interaction, some shifting uncomfortably in their seats, as they recognized the unnecessary hostility in Marcus's tone. A middle-aged woman near the window frowned disapprovingly, while a young man with headphones looked up from his phone with obvious discomfort. The elderly man stood quietly for a moment, considering his options. He could insist on his rights as a senior citizen, produce identification to prove his age, or create a confrontation that would accomplish nothing except disturbing other passengers. Instead, he chose the path he had learned through decades of military service: compliance with authority, even when that authority was being exercised poorly. "Of course," he said simply, beginning the longer walk toward the back of the bus. "I apologize for the misunderstanding." His gracious response only irritated Marcus further. He had expected argument or complaint, not this calm acceptance that somehow made him feel like the unreasonable one in the interaction. "That's right. Just find yourself a seat back there, and we can get moving." As the elderly man made his way down the narrow aisle, other passengers watched with a mixture of sympathy and embarrassment. Several people offered him their seats, but he politely declined each offer, eventually settling into an empty seat near the back of the bus. The bus lurched forward as Marcus pulled away from the stop, perhaps with more acceleration than necessary. Through his rearview mirror, he watched the elderly man steadying himself against the sudden movement, with the practiced balance of someone who had learned to maintain equilibrium under challenging conditions. Some people think the world owes them something just because they've been around for a while, Marcus muttered, loud enough for passengers near the front to hear. "Time to learn that respect is earned, not given." The comment hung in the air like a challenge, though the elderly man in the back seat showed no reaction. He sat quietly, watching the familiar Seattle neighborhoods pass by the rain-streaked windows, occasionally reaching up to adjust something on his jacket collar that Marcus couldn't see clearly from his position. At the next stop, more passengers boarded, including a group of college students, who immediately claimed several of the front seats that Marcus had been so concerned about preserving. The irony was not lost on other passengers, though Marcus seemed oblivious to the contradiction in his earlier reasoning. As the bus continued its route through downtown, Marcus found his attention repeatedly drawn to his rearview mirror, where the elderly man sat with unusual composure. There was something about the way he carried himself, even while seated, that suggested a background Marcus couldn't quite identify. The man's posture was perfectly straight. His hands were positioned with military precision, and his eyes continued to scan the environment with what appeared to be automatic threat assessment. But Marcus dismissed these observations as the products of his imagination. In his worldview, elderly passengers were simply elderly passengers, deserving of basic service, but not special accommodation or particular respect. The bus made several more stops, and as it began to fill with the morning rush crowd, Marcus noticed that the elderly man had quietly given up his back seat to a pregnant woman who was having difficulty finding a place to sit. The gesture was made without announcement or expectation of recognition, simply a quiet act of courtesy that went unnoticed by most passengers. It was during the stop at Pine Street that Marcus finally got a clear view of something that would change everything he thought he knew about the man he had dismissed so casually. As the elderly man reached up to help the pregnant woman with her bag in the overhead rack, his worn leather jacket shifted slightly, revealing a small cloth patch sewn onto the upper sleeve. From Marcus's position in the driver's seat, the patch was partially obscured, but he could make out enough details to recognize that it was military in nature. His curiosity piqued, despite himself. Marcus adjusted his mirror to get a better look. When the elderly man sat back down and the jacket shifted again, Marcus could see the patch more clearly. What he saw made his blood freeze and his hands tighten involuntarily on the steering wheel. The patch bore the distinctive insignia of the 75th Ranger Regiment, one of the United States Army's most elite special operations units. But it wasn't just any Ranger patch. It was vintage, clearly from decades past, and surrounded by smaller pins and ribbons that Marcus couldn't identify, but that obviously represented significant military achievements. Marcus's grandfather had been military, and he recognized the basic insignia, even if he didn't understand all the specific details. What he did understand was that the man he had treated with such casual disrespect wasn't just an elderly passenger taking up space on his bus. He was a veteran who had served in one of the most demanding and dangerous units in the American military. But even this revelation might not have been enough to overcome Marcus's stubborn pride, if not for what happened at the next stop. The doors opened at 4th Avenue, and among the passengers boarding was a young man in army dress uniform, clearly heading to or from some official military function. The soldier was perhaps 25 years old, with the bearing of someone still early in his military career, but proud of his service. As the young soldier made his way down the aisle looking for a seat, his eyes fell upon the elderly man in the back of the bus. For a moment, the soldier paused, his attention caught by something about the older man's appearance. Then his gaze focused on the patch visible on the leather jacket, and his entire demeanor changed instantly. Without hesitation, the young soldier snapped to attention right there in the aisle of the moving bus and rendered a crisp military salute. "Good morning, Sergeant Major," he said, with obvious respect and recognition. The elderly man looked up with surprise, then stood carefully and returned the salute with movements that were still precise, despite his age. "At ease, soldier," he replied, his voice carrying an authority that Marcus had completely missed during their earlier interaction. "Sergeant Major Williams," the young soldier continued. "It's an honor to meet you, sir. I've heard about your service with the Rangers. My drill instructor used to tell stories about the operations in Vietnam." The elderly man, now revealed to be a retired sergeant major with a distinguished combat record, smiled modestly. "Those stories probably get better with each telling, son. But I appreciate your courtesy." Marcus felt as if the bottom had dropped out of his world. Through his rearview mirror, he watched the interaction between the young soldier and the man he had treated with such dismissive rudeness just minutes before. Sergeant Major Williams wasn't just any veteran. He was clearly someone whose service record commanded immediate respect from active duty military personnel. Other passengers had noticed the exchange as well, and word began to spread quietly through the bus about the elderly man's true identity. The pregnant woman he had helped looked embarrassed that she had accepted assistance from someone whose own comfort should have been a priority. The college students in the front seats began to understand the irony of their positions. But it was Marcus who felt the full weight of his error most acutely. As a city bus driver, he had transported thousands of passengers over the years, treating each interaction as routine and forgettable. He had never considered that among those anonymous faces might be individuals whose contributions to society far exceeded anything he had ever accomplished. The young soldier eventually found a seat, but not before engaging Sergeant Major Williams in a brief conversation about military service that revealed even more about the older man's distinguished background. References to multiple deployments, combat decorations, and leadership positions painted a picture of someone who had dedicated his life to serving others and protecting freedoms that civilians like Marcus took for granted. As the bus approached the stop, where Marcus knew many downtown workers typically disembarked, he found himself facing a decision that would define his character. He could continue driving, pretend that nothing had happened, and hope that the incident would be forgotten by all involved. Or he could acknowledge his mistake and attempt to make amends for behavior that had dishonored both his position and the man he had wronged. The bus pulled up to the federal building stop, where Sergeant Major Williams rose to disembark, along with several other passengers. As he made his way toward the front of the bus, Marcus felt his conscience weighing heavily on his actions from earlier in the journey. "Sir," Marcus called out as the elderly veteran approached the exit doors. "Sergeant Major Williams, could I speak with you for just a moment?" The bus fell silent as other passengers sensed the significance of the moment. Sergeant Major Williams paused near the driver's seat, his expression patient but curious. Marcus's voice cracked slightly as he spoke. "Sir, I owe you a profound apology. Earlier, when you boarded my bus, I treated you with disrespect that was completely unacceptable. I made assumptions about you based on your appearance, and I failed to show you the courtesy that every passenger deserves, let alone the honor due to someone who has served our country with such distinction." Sergeant Major Williams studied Marcus's face for a moment, seeing genuine remorse rather than hollow words motivated by embarrassment. "Son," he said quietly, "we all make mistakes in judgment. What matters is how we respond when we realize our errors." "Sir, I was wrong," Marcus continued, his voice now carrying clearly to every passenger on the bus. "You asked for nothing more than basic respect, and I failed to provide even that. Your service record shouldn't be necessary to earn decent treatment, but knowing what you've sacrificed for this country makes my behavior even more shameful." Other passengers watched in respectful silence as Marcus struggled with the implications of his actions. Several people had pulled out phones, recognizing that they were witnessing a moment of genuine accountability that was rare in everyday interactions. "I spent 12 years driving this route," Marcus said, "thinking I knew something about the people who ride my bus. Today you've taught me that I don't know anything about the passengers I serve, and that every person who climbs these steps deserves better than the assumptions I've been making." Sergeant Major Williams nodded slowly, recognizing sincerity when he heard it. "Marcus," he said, reading the driver's name tag, "I've seen good men make mistakes under pressure and learn from them. That's how we grow. The question is what you do with this lesson going forward." The young soldier, who had recognized the sergeant major earlier, had remained on the bus to witness this exchange. He approached the front, standing at respectful attention. "Driver, if I may," he said. Sergeant Major Williams served 3 tours in Vietnam with the Rangers, earned the Silver Star, Bronze Star, and Purple Heart, and later trained special operations candidates for 2 decades. He's the kind of leader who taught us that respect should flow both ways, regardless of rank or position. Marcus felt the weight of these revelations, settling on his shoulders like a heavy burden. He had not just disrespected an elderly passenger, he had dishonored a man whose contributions to American freedom were literally written in military history. "Sergeant Major," Marcus said, his voice steadying with resolve, "I know I can't undo what happened earlier, but I want you to know that this conversation has changed how I'll approach every passenger who boards this bus. Every person deserves the dignity you showed me today, even when I failed to show it to you." Sergeant Major Williams extended his hand to Marcus, who shook it with obvious gratitude. "Son, we all serve in different ways. You keep this city moving, get people to their jobs and their families safely. That's honorable work. Just remember that everyone who rides your bus is carrying their own story, their own struggles, their own contributions that might not be visible on the surface." As Sergeant Major Williams prepared to exit the bus, other passengers spontaneously began to applaud. What had started as an uncomfortable incident had transformed into a moment of recognition and learning that reminded everyone present about the importance of treating each other with basic human dignity. The elderly veteran paused at the exit doors and turned back to address the bus full of passengers. "Ladies and gentlemen," he said, his voice carrying the natural command presence that had made him an effective military leader. I want you to know that what happened here today wasn't about my military service. It was about the kind of society we choose to create through our daily interactions with each other. He gestured toward Marcus, who was listening intently from the driver's seat. This young man made a mistake, recognized it, and had the courage to acknowledge it publicly. That takes character. We all make assumptions about people based on what we see on the surface. What matters is our willingness to learn and do better. The applause that followed was not just for Sergeant Major Williams, but for the lesson in humility and growth that had unfolded on a routine bus ride through downtown Seattle. Passengers who had witnessed the transformation from disrespect to recognition understood that they had seen something significant, a reminder that heroes often travel among us unnoticed, and that every interaction is an opportunity to choose kindness over judgment. As the bus doors closed and Marcus pulled away from the federal building stop, he watched Sergeant Major Williams walk toward the entrance with the same quiet dignity he had maintained throughout their encounter. Other passengers remained subdued, many clearly reflecting on their own assumptions and biases. The young soldier, who had recognized the sergeant major's insignia, approached Marcus before his own stop. "Driver," he said, "what you did back there took guts. In the military, we call that owning your mistakes and driving on. Sergeant Major Williams respects that kind of integrity." Marcus nodded, still processing the full implications of the morning's events. "I've been driving this route for 12 years, he said, "and I thought I knew what I was doing. Turns out, I didn't know anything about the people I was supposed to be serving." The remainder of Marcus's shift passed quietly, but with a different energy than usual. He found himself greeting each passenger with genuine courtesy, offering assistance to those who needed it, and recognizing that every person boarding his bus deserved the same respect he would want for his own family members. By the end of the day, word of the incident had spread beyond the bus route itself. Passengers had shared the story on social media, where it quickly gained attention as an example of both the discrimination that veterans sometimes face and the power of accountability and growth. Marcus returned home that evening to find messages from his supervisor, local news stations, and community organizations who had heard about his public apology to Sergeant Major Williams. Rather than facing discipline for his initial behavior, Marcus found himself being praised for his willingness to acknowledge his mistake and commit to doing better. But the real change was internal. Marcus had spent years developing a cynical view of his passengers, seeing them as problems to be managed rather than people to be served. His encounter with Sergeant Major Williams had shattered those assumptions and reminded him of the fundamental dignity that every person deserved. The next morning, Marcus arrived for his shift with a different perspective on his role as a public transit driver. He had printed a small sign that he taped near his rearview mirror. "Every passenger has a story worth respecting." As the number 47 bus began another day of routes through downtown Seattle, Marcus found himself genuinely curious about the lives and experiences of the people who trusted him to transport them safely to their destinations. He greeted each passenger with authentic courtesy, offered assistance without being asked, and created an atmosphere of respect that made his bus a more pleasant place for everyone. The story of Sergeant Major Williams and the bus driver who learned to see beyond appearances became more than just a viral social media post. It became a reminder that heroism often travels quietly among us, that assumptions can blind us to the contributions of others, and that the courage to admit mistakes and change behavior can transform both individuals and communities. For Marcus Thompson, what began as a routine Tuesday morning had become a life-changing lesson in humility, respect, and the power of second chances. He never saw Sergeant Major Williams again, but the veteran's quiet dignity and gracious response to an apology had forever changed how Marcus approached his work and his interactions with others. And sometimes, that's how heroes make their greatest impact. Not through dramatic gestures or public recognition, but through quiet moments that remind the rest of us what it means to treat each other with the dignity that every human being deserves.